In March 1941, the world was burning, Europe engulfed in chaos, Asia bracing for impact. And across the Atlantic, the United States stood at a crossroads. For nearly 2 years, America had watched from afar as Hitler's armies stormed across the continent. The public wanted peace. Yet the world's survival seemed to hinge on one decision. And that decision came on March 11th, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, a moment that would change the course of history. With a stroke of his pen, Roosevelt broke the chains of neutrality. No longer would America stand idle while its allies bled. We must be the arsenal of democracy, he declared. And with those words, the industrial heart of the United States began to beat for nations fighting for freedom: Britain, China, and soon, the Soviet Union. But this was not just politics or policy, it was a gamble. The world held its breath as the U.S. stepped closer to the fire of war. Factories that once made cars now forged tanks. Shipyards echoed with the sounds of hammers building destroyers for distant seas. Women took up tools. Men lined up to serve. And an entire nation began to move. Not in battle yet, but in purpose. Imagine being in London, that week, bombs still falling from the sky. But somewhere in the distance, hope flickering again. For those who had been standing alone against tyranny, Roosevelt's signature meant lifelines of food, weapons, and aircraft were on the way. The Lend-Lease Act was not just paperwork, it was a promise that the world would not be left to darkness. Yet, behind every victory and every act of aid, there were questions. Could America remain safe while supplying the war? Could generosity outweigh risk? This bold move would test not just a nation's resources, but its soul. And as ships began to cross the Atlantic carrying supplies for the British war effort, one thing became clear: the United States was no longer a bystander. It had taken its first step into global responsibility. The signing of the Lend-Lease Act marked a turning point, a quiet but powerful moment when the tide of war began to shift. It was not a declaration of war, but it was a declaration of intent that democracy would not be abandoned. If you are fascinated by the moments that shaped our world, by the choices that defined nations, and the courage that changed history, then you are in the right place. Hit that like button to support our channel. Subscribe to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. And turn on notifications so you never miss a story from the past that still speaks to our present. Together, let us explore how one decision made in March 1941 began to transform a neutral power into the beating heart of the fight for freedom. As the ink dried on Roosevelt's signature in Washington, half a world away, another kind of tension was brewing, not in factories or shipyards, but in the shadowy corridors of power in the Balkans. Europe was already on fire, but for the small kingdom of Yugoslavia, the flames were drawing closer by the day. To the north loomed the German Reach, unstoppable and coldly efficient. To the south, the mountains of Greece echoed with the sound of Italian artillery. And caught between these two giants stood Prince Regent Paul of Yugoslavia, a man trying to hold together a fragile nation, while the world outside demanded allegiance to one side or the other. Hitler's eyes had long turned toward the Balkans. The region was more than a political prize. It was a strategic bridge to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. If the Axis were to crush Greece and eventually strike at the Soviet Union, control of Yugoslav territory was not optional, it was essential. The railway line from Belgrade to Salonika, threading through mountains and valleys, was the artery through which troops and supplies could flow. To Hitler, neutrality was an obstacle. Cooperation was the only acceptable outcome. In late February 1941, the Fuhrer summoned Prince Paul to his residence in Berchtesgaden. It was a meeting dressed in courtesy but heavy with threat. Hitler spoke of friendship, of shared destiny, of the Axis standing strong against the decay of the old world. He offered promises: access to the Aegean Sea, territorial gains after victory, a secure place among the new powers of Europe. But beneath every word was an unspoken warning: stand with us, be swept aside. Prince Paul listened carefully. He was an aristocrat of grace and intellect, fluent in several languages, and deeply aware that every decision he made would echo across a divided country. Yugoslavia was a patchwork of ethnicities and loyalties: Serbs, Croats, Slavens, Bosniaks bound by uneasy compromise. Aligning openly with Hitler might tear that balance apart, triggering revolt at home even before foreign soldiers crossed the border. He knew, too, of Italy's ambitions in the Balkans. Mussolini had already invaded Greece and eyed Yugoslav territory greedily. To side with the Axis might mean exchanging independence for occupation. So Paul chose neutrality, or tried to. He hoped to steer a delicate path, to buy time until the winds of war shifted. But neutrality in 1941 was not peace. It was a balancing act on a razor's edge. In Belgrade, ministers argued fiercely. Some saw Germany's strength as irresistible, believing that joining the Axis was the only way to survive. Others viewed Hitler's promises with deep suspicion, aware that the price of alliance was submission. Meanwhile, outside the walls of diplomacy, the German war machine was already on the move. Trains loaded with tanks and soldiers rumbled through Austria toward Bulgaria. The Wehrmacht was preparing for Operation Marita. The invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia sat directly in the path. Hitler's generals urged him to demand transit rights through Yugoslav territory, to move swiftly before the spring. But Hitler, ever calculating, decided on a gentler approach. He would first secure an agreement, then use it as he pleased. As German troops poured into neighboring Bulgaria, Yugoslavia's anxiety deepened. Reports came in of columns of vehicles stretching for miles, of airfields being built near the border, of the German flag rising over towns that had once been quiet. The Balkans, always a region of fragile alliances, now seemed ready to fracture entirely. Inside the royal palace, Prince Paul faced the impossible. His advisors brought him daily updates. German pressure increasing, Italian troops massing on the Adriatic, British diplomats urging resistance. He could feel the country's loyalty fraying, the army divided in its sympathies, the streets buzzing with rumors. In the cafes of Belgrade, men whispered of betrayal, of foreign plots, of the fate of small nations caught between empires. When Hitler's envoy returned with another offer, a place in the tripartite pact, Paul hesitated. On paper, it was simple. Yugoslavia would join the Axis, but its sovereignty and territory would be guaranteed. Yet he knew such guarantees meant little once the tanks began to roll. Still, delay could mean destruction. To resist Germany outright would invite invasion. To submit would destroy the fragile pride of his people. In early March, he finally gave a cautious nod, an agreement in principle, not in spirit. Yugoslavia would sign the pact, but without committing troops, without allowing German forces to cross its borders. It was a compromise born of desperation. Hitler smiled at the news, believing he had secured another pawn for his expanding empire, but he underestimated the storm brewing within Yugoslavia itself. The signing of the pact sparked outrage among the people. In Belgrade, protests erupted almost overnight. Crowds filled the streets waving flags and chanting for freedom, for honor, for resistance. Officers within the Yugoslav army began plotting in secret, furious that their country's independence had been traded for promises. Within weeks, their anger would explode into open defiance, a coup d'état that would shock Hitler and change the destiny of the Balkans. But on that March day in 1941, the future was still unwritten. Prince Paul walked through the marble halls of his palace, knowing he had chosen what he believed was the only path to survival, even if it cost him everything. He had watched the great powers of Europe fall one by one, and now his own country stood at the edge of that same abyss. Beyond his borders, the thunder of war was growing louder. In Washington, Roosevelt had just thrown America's weight behind the Allies. In Berlin, Hitler was preparing for a new conquest, and in the heart of the Balkans, one man's struggle to preserve neutrality was about to collide with the unstoppable tide of history. In early March 1941, as the Balkans became the next flashpoint in Hitler's grand strategy, Mussolini, bruised by humiliation and desperate to redeem Italy's pride, decided to take personal command of his forces in Albania. The winter snows had barely begun to melt when the Italian dictator arrived at the front, determined to witness what he believed would be a glorious breakthrough against the Greeks. His black uniform stood out sharply against the grey, rain-soaked mountains. Reporters, photographers, and generals surrounded him as he strutted through the muddy fields near the Devoli and Vajos rivers, promising that Italy would soon reclaim its honor. But the landscape ahead was not one that easily yielded to confidence. It was a fortress of stone, defended by men who refused to bend. The Greeks, though exhausted and ill-equipped, had transformed the rugged terrain into a wall of resistance, their trenches carved deep into frozen soil, their machine gun nests camouflaged among rocks and pine trees. They had learned to fight the elements as fiercely as the enemy. Across the no-man's land, Italian artillery opened fire with thunderous force, shell after shell raining down on Greek positions. The skies turned grey with smoke, the ground shook, and the valleys echoed with the unending roar of guns. Mussolini, standing at an observation post, watched through his field glasses and smiled grimly. He was sure this time the Greeks would crumble. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. The focal point of the offensive was Hill 731, a modest rise of earth and stone that would soon become legendary. It dominated the surrounding valleys and served as a gateway into the Greek defensive line. If the Italians could take it, they might finally break through. But defending it were battle-hardened men of the Greek 1st Division, who had already repelled multiple assaults through winter storms and starvation. Their commander, Colonel Dimitrios Kaslas, inspired them with quiet conviction, reminding them that behind this hill lay their homes, their families, their nation. "Step back," he said simply, and they obeyed. The bombardment began at dawn on March 9th. For hours, Italian artillery pounded Hill 731, flattening trees, tearing open trenches, and sending rocks and soil cascading down its slopes. The noise was unbearable, a continuous roar that seemed to swallow every other sound. Mussolini watched from a nearby ridge, confident that no living soul could survive such fire. But when the shelling ceased and the Italian infantry began their advance, they were met with a wall of rifle and machine gun fire. The Greeks, blackened by smoke and caked in mud, rose from the rubble like specters. They fought with bayonets, grenades, and sheer will. Every time the Italians reached the crest, they were hurled back by counterattacks as fierce as the mountain winds. For days the pattern repeated itself. The Italians would shell the hill, charge, and be driven back. The slopes became soaked with rain and blood. Soldiers slipped in the mud, stumbling over the fallen, while medics carried the wounded down under constant fire. The Greeks fought with a ferocity that stunned even their enemies. Some Italian officers later described them as possessed by the spirit of their ancestors. At times, the fighting descended into brutal hand-to-hand combat, bayonets clashing against shovels, rocks, and bare fists. Mussolini visited the front lines again on March 12, frustrated that his carefully planned spring offensive was faltering. The war correspondents who had been summoned to witness a triumph now wrote cautiously, describing the heroic resistance of the Greeks. His generals pleaded for more time, more shells, more men, but the dictator grew restless. Every failure was a personal humiliation. Every day without victory another blow to his pride. He ordered fresh attacks, convinced that sheer determination would finally break the defenders. But Hill 731 refused to fall. By March 20th, after 12 days of relentless fighting, the Italian advance had stalled completely. The once green slopes had been transformed into a barren wasteland of craters, shattered weapons, and twisted trees. Thousands lay dead or wounded on both sides. The Greeks, though nearly out of ammunition, still held the summit. They had been bombarded with more than 100,000 shells, but their line had not broken. Mussolini, his uniform now stained with dust and rain, stood silently as reports came in. The Italian army had suffered terrible losses for no gain. Hill 731 had become what later generations would call the Verdun of the Greco-Italian War, a symbol of unyielding defense, of courage forged in hardship. In the end, the Italian offensive collapsed. Mussolini returned to Rome humiliated once more, his dream of victory buried beneath the mountains of Albania. His gamble had failed, and in doing so, he had only deepened Italy's dependence on Hitler. The German Führer, watching from Berlin, saw clearly what his ally could not. Italy's army was broken, its spirit exhausted, and if the Axis wanted control of the Balkans, it would now fall to the Wehrmacht to finish what Mussolini had begun. Hill 731 stood as a testament to the resilience of those who fought there, a place where ordinary soldiers held back a greater force, not with numbers or technology, but with determination and belief. The world would remember it as a small hill that became a mountain of legend. And as Mussolini's pride gave way to defeat, the winds over the Davoli and Vijos rivers carried the echoes of a battle that defined the fate of nations. As Mussolini's grand offensive against Greece collapsed in the muddy hills of Albania, the ripples of his failure spread across Europe. In Berlin, Hitler was no longer amused by his allies' blunders. The Italian campaign, meant to display Axis strength in the Mediterranean, had instead drawn the Balkans into chaos and threatened to expose Germany's southern flank, just as plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union were nearing completion. Every delay, every setback, risked throwing his entire timetable into disarray. And so, in the first days of March 1941, the Führer made his decision. The Balkans would no longer be left to chance. The German war machine would move south swiftly, decisively, and under his direct command. The first sign of that decision came when German armored columns began rumbling across the frozen plains of Bulgaria. Villages stirred at dawn to the sound of engines and the sight of long convoys stretching beyond the horizon. Tanks, artillery, trucks packed with soldiers, all bearing the black cross of the Wehrmacht. Officially, Bulgaria was not at war. Its government, led by Tsar Bori, had declared Sofia an open city, hoping to spare its people from destruction should the conflict spread further. But the truth was plain for all to see. Bulgaria had opened its borders to the Germans, granting them a gateway into Greece and Yugoslavia. For the Bulgarian people, it was a moment of uneasy calm wrapped in fear and resignation. They had seen what happened to nations caught between the Axis and the Allies. Many still remembered the bitterness of the First World War and the territorial losses that had followed. Now, as the boots of German soldiers echoed through Sofia's cobblestone streets, there was little illusion about who held the power. Posters went up proclaiming friendship between Bulgaria and Germany, and German officers dined politely with Bulgarian officials in the capital's elegant cafes. But beneath the polite smiles and measured words, there was an unspoken understanding. Neutrality was no longer an option. Hitler had promised Tsar Boris that Bulgaria's sovereignty would be respected, and its territorial claims in Thrace and Macedonia fulfilled once Greece was subdued. In return, he demanded access railways, roads, supply depots, airfields. It was not a negotiation, it was an order wrapped in diplomacy. Within days, The swastika flew from strategic outposts across the country. Engineers began repairing bridges, Luftwaffe crews established forward airbases, and supply trains thundered south toward the Greek border. The invasion was no longer a matter of if, but when. To the west, Yugoslavia watched in mounting dread. The German presence in Bulgaria meant that the Axis could now strike from three sides: Italy from Albania, Germany from the north, and Bulgaria from the east. Prince Regent Paul, already under immense pressure from both Hitler and his own divided government, realized that his nation stood at the crossroads of history. But fear of internal revolt, particularly from the fiercely pro-British Serbian officers, made any alliance with the Axis a dangerous gamble. Hitler's patience, however, was running thin. Meanwhile, to the south, Greece braced for the storm. Its soldiers, still entrenched along the mountainous front with Italy, could see German aircraft patrolling the skies above Bulgaria. Their commanders understood what that meant. Once the snows melted, those planes would not remain idle. The Greek High Command appealed urgently to London for aid, and British reinforcements began arriving, too few and too late to shift the balance, but enough to show that Greece would not face the coming storm alone. In Ankara, the Turkish government watched these developments with careful calculation. Turkey's strategic position made it a prize for both sides. But President İsmet İnönü was determined to keep his country out of the war for as long as possible. Officially, Turkey maintained cordial relations with Germany, hosting diplomatic envoys and exchanging trade agreements. But behind the scenes, Turkish intelligence followed the German buildup in Bulgaria with growing alarm. The Turks knew that if Germany dominated the Balkans, the balance of power in the region would shift dangerously close to their borders. Yet to confront Hitler openly was to invite disaster. Thus, Turkey chose the path of quiet vigilance, arming its borders, reinforcing the Bosporus defenses, and strengthening its diplomatic ties with Britain, all while keeping a friendly face toward Berlin. It was a delicate dance, one that required both restraint and foresight. The Turks understood that wars often consumed those who stood too close to them, and for now, the best defense was to remain outwardly neutral while quietly preparing for the worst. In the streets of Sofia, the arrival of the German army brought both order and tension. Markets reopened, trams continued their routes, and life seemed to go on, but the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Locals watched as columns of soldiers marched through the city, their boots clattering on stone, their faces impassive. Children waved, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. To many, it felt as though history itself was moving through their streets, a force too vast to resist or comprehend. German officers established their headquarters in elegant pro-war buildings, filling them with maps, radio sets, and the low murmur of strategic discussions. Their conversations turned constantly to timing, logistics, weather. Hitler demanded precision, and his generals worked feverishly to deliver it. Operation Marita, the codename for the invasion of Greece, was being assembled piece by piece. The Italians would continue their pressure from the west, pinning Greek forces in Albania, while German divisions swept through Bulgaria and struck south through the Struma and Axios valleys. It would be a lightning strike, designed to crush Greece before the Allies could react. By the end of March 1941, the Balkans had become a chessboard crowded with pieces moving toward inevitable collision. Mussolini's ambitions had drawn Hitler into a region he had once hoped to leave untouched. And now the stage was set for yet another campaign. For the people of Bulgaria, the sight of German convoys heading south became an everyday scene, each one a silent herald of the storm about to break. In this uneasy calm, the tension was almost unbearable. The rivers ran swollen with spring rains, the skies filled with the distant hum of aircraft, and across the border, Greek sentries peered into the mist, knowing that the next time those engines roared overhead, it would not be for show. The German army was gathering. The Balkans were tightening like a coiled spring, and the world waited for the moment when all restraint would shatter into war once more. While Europe trembled beneath the weight of advancing armies and political gambits, far away under the scorching African sun, another kind of war was unfolding, one that few in Berlin or London truly understood. In the rugged, sun-bleached landscapes of East Africa, men from Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, and other British colonies were rewriting the rules of speed and endurance. Their mission was simple in order but monumental in execution: drive the Italians out of Somaliland and reclaim the Horn of Africa for the Allies. What followed would become one of the most astonishing military pursuits in modern warfare, a relentless chase across nearly 1,000 kilometers of unforgiving terrain that would astonish even the hardened commanders of the British Empire. When news reached British headquarters that the Italian defenses in East Africa were faltering, orders were given to press the advantage. Among the troops chosen for this daring operation were the Nigerian regiments, men who had already proven their courage in the face of impossible odds. They were accustomed to the heat, to the dust, to the harshness of landscapes that stripped the weak and rewarded the resilient. Yet even for them, the task ahead seemed unthinkable. From the Ethiopian highlands to the coast of British Somaliland stretched a corridor of mountains, rivers, and deserts, all occupied or guarded by Italian forces. The campaign began in a blaze of motion, led by British officers but driven by the strength and determination of West African soldiers. The Nigerians set out on what would become a record-breaking march, 930 kilometers covered in less than 10 days. Vehicles broke down, supply lines stretched to the limit, and the roads, where they existed at all, turned to mud under the sudden seasonal rains. Yet the Nigerians pressed on. When engines failed, they marched. When food ran low, they rationed what little they had. Theirs was not a campaign of comfort or spectacle, it was a test of will, of sheer endurance, of what men could achieve when the cause was larger than themselves. The Italians had once boasted of their empire in East Africa, calling it the crown jewel of Mussolini's ambitions. But those boasts now echoed hollow across the empty hills. The garrisons were isolated, their supply routes shattered, and their morale waning. They had expected the British to move cautiously, to wait for reinforcements or better weather. Instead, they were confronted by an army that moved like the wind, appearing in places thought unreachable, striking swiftly, then vanishing into the horizon. The Nigerians earned a new reputation among their comrades and even their enemies. They moved with the precision of predators and the patience of hunters. In one intercepted Italian dispatch, an officer compared them to cheetahs chasing a bull, swift, coordinated, and unstoppable once they had the scent. Villages and small settlements along the route became waypoints in this extraordinary pursuit. Local communities watched in awe as endless columns of men in khaki uniforms passed by, their rifles glinting in the sunlight, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. The pace was unrelenting, sometimes more than 100 kilometers in a single day. Sleep was a luxury, rest an afterthought. Every mile gained was another step toward the collapse of Italian East Africa. By the 5th day, the Nigerian regiments had already captured several key positions, including outposts that the Italians had believed impregnable. Their discipline was unmatched, their coordination seamless. The campaign was not only a display of physical endurance but also of strategic brilliance. British command utilized air reconnaissance to guide their advance, and local guides helped them navigate the labyrinthine valleys and arid plains. Still, it was the sheer determination of the men on the ground that carried the operation forward. When trucks could no longer move through the rough terrain, they pushed them by hand. When bridges collapsed, they built makeshift crossings using fallen trees and salvaged metal. As the Nigerian forces advanced deeper into Somaliland, they began to encounter stronger Italian resistance. The Italians, desperate to hold their remaining positions, launched counterattacks from fortified ridges and river crossings. Yet every attempt to halt the pursuit failed. The Nigerians fought with ferocity and discipline. Using cover, maneuver, and speed to their advantage, their marksmanship and tactical coordination dismantled Italian defenses one by one. Soldiers who had once been dismissed as colonial auxiliaries now proved themselves as professionals equal to any army in the world. By the 8th day, word spread through Allied command of the unprecedented speed of the Nigerian advance. Commanders in Cairo and London received reports that sounded almost impossible: enemy lines collapsing faster than maps could be updated. The British High Command began to grasp what this meant. The entire Axis position in East Africa was crumbling, not under the weight of tanks or bombers, but under the relentless pace of men who refused to stop. When the Nigerians finally reached the key Italian strongholds near Mogadishu and Berbera, they did not pause for rest or celebration. They attacked with precision, overwhelming exhausted Italian defenders who could no longer organize a coherent defense. The sight of the Nigerian columns approaching, a storm of dust rising behind them, was enough to break the will of many Italian units. Within days, vital ports and depots that had sustained the Italian presence in the region fell into British hands. The pursuit ended as suddenly as it began. 10 days after it started, the once proud Italian army in Somaliland was shattered, its officers captured, its flags lowered. The Nigerian troops had accomplished what few thought possible: a campaign of speed and coordination so remarkable that even veteran generals compared it to the great marches of history. But beyond the statistics and the records, there was something deeper in their victory. For the men who had marched those hundreds of kilometers, through heat and exhaustion, through enemy fire and barren wilderness, this was more than a military success, it was a statement. They had proven that courage, discipline, and resilience were not the property of any one nation or race. They had shown the world that Africa, too, could stand tall in the struggle for freedom. In the grand sweep of World War II, their triumph in Somaliland might have seemed a small chapter compared to the vast battles in Europe and the Pacific. Yet, for those who knew the desert winds, who remembered the endless march, it was a story of endurance and pride that echoed far beyond the sands of East Africa. The Nigerian soldiers returned home not just as victors, but as symbols of a changing world, one where the courage of men from distant lands helped turn the tide of a global war. By mid-March 1941, the world stood on the edge of something far greater than anyone could yet comprehend. What had begun as a European conflict had transformed into a global storm, pulling nations, empires, and ordinary people into its widening orbit. The war now burned fiercely across continents, smoldering in the deserts of Africa, thundering in the mountains of the Balkans, and whispering in the halls of Washington, where decisions were being made that would soon change the fate of the world. In East Africa, the dust of victory still hung in the air as Nigerian and other Allied colonial troops pressed forward, reclaiming vast territories once held by Mussolini's forces. Their relentless pursuit, their courage under the blazing sun, had shattered the illusion of Axis invincibility beyond Europe. It was proof that the fight against tyranny was not limited by geography or skin color, that freedom's defenders came from every corner of the earth. For those soldiers, victory meant more than strategic triumph. It was a declaration that the future would no longer belong to empires built on oppression, but to the nations and peoples who fought for justice and dignity. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Balkans were becoming a powder keg. In Yugoslavia, diplomatic tension teetered on the edge of explosion as Prince Regent Paul struggled to balance neutrality against Hitler's mounting pressure. The faint hope of remaining outside the conflict was crumbling, as Germany's entry into Bulgaria made the region's fate inevitable. Villagers who once prayed for peace now heard the thunder of tanks in the distance. Farmers left their fields. Families gathered in fear, and rumors spread faster than news itself. Every man and woman sensed that the storm of war was about to descend upon their homeland. In Greece, the situation was no less dire. Mussolini's reckless ambition had ignited a fire that refused to die. The Greek soldiers who had once stood proudly atop Hill 731, known now as the Verdun of the Greco-Italian War, remained unbroken, their courage echoing through the mountains. Yet as German divisions massed to the north, everyone knew the next chapter would be bloodier still. For Greece, every sunrise brought both pride and dread, pride in their defiance, dread in the knowledge that the most powerful army in Europe was preparing to strike. And far across the ocean, in the United States, a quiet revolution was taking place not in the streets, but in the factories, shipyards, and hearts of its people. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, he did more than authorize supplies to Britain and its allies. He lit the first spark of America's awakening. The nation that had sworn to stay out of foreign wars was now becoming the lifeline of democracy. Cargo ships filled with food, weapons, and hope began to cross the Atlantic, braving the threat of German submarines to deliver the means of survival to embattled nations, though American soldiers had yet to join the fight. Their industry, their resolve, and their spirit had already entered the war. The world, in that moment, was suspended between uncertainty and inevitability. Each decision, each stroke of a pen, each step of a soldier, each whispered conversation between leaders was shaping the destiny of millions. The Axis powers seemed unstoppable, their banners stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, from the Arctic to the Balkans. Yet beneath the surface, resistance was growing. From the deserts of Somaliland to the streets of Belgrade, from the factories of Detroit to the alleys of Athens, the will to fight back was spreading like a quiet flame. History, though written by victors, is carried forward by the courage of those who refused to surrender. In March 1941, that courage could be seen everywhere among Greek soldiers standing firm against bombardment, among Nigerian troops marching hundreds of kilometers through hostile terrain, among factory workers in America who toiled through the night forging the tools of freedom. It was a moment when humanity, battered but unbroken, began to turn its gaze from despair toward determination. The war was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun its darkest and most decisive chapters. Before it would end, cities would burn, continents would be scarred, and millions of lives would be lost. But within that suffering lay the seeds of unity, the realization that no single nation, no single people, could stand alone against the tide of oppression. The events of March 1941 were not merely pages in a military chronicle, they were the beating heart of a world struggling to redefine itself. As the guns thundered in the distance, and the world hurtled toward the years of its greatest trial, the stories of those days remain a testament to endurance, sacrifice, and faith. They remind us that even in the darkest times, courage can still illuminate the path forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most turbulent weeks, a time when the fate of nations hung in the balance and ordinary men and women became heroes. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the moments that shaped our world, reminding us that history is not just about the past, it is about who we are and who we strive to become.